Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to Tales of Cape Cod and the Old Colonial Courthouse. My name is Gene Gwill. I'm the president of the board, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Tonight's program is the next to the last program in our 2021 Summer Speaker Series. Our final program is a wrap-up on jazz with Wampanoag Tribal member Morgan Peters as our speaker. The program will start at 7 o'clock, the usual time, next Monday night. After that, we will have an annual meeting on November the 15th. It will include a presentation by Anthony Sammarco, and his topic is Thanksgiving traditions in New England. Please mark your calendars for that. It will be open to the public, and we hope you'll hear more about it in the coming weeks. Tonight's program is sponsored by Susan and Peter Alifanakis. We thank you. These programs would not be possible without our sponsors. Now, I'm excited to welcome back to Tales of Cape Cod a Cape Cod native, a best-selling author, and a long-term friend of Tales of Cape Cod, Casey Sherman. Casey is perhaps best known for his 2009 book, The Finest Hours, as well as Boston Strong, which became the basis of the movie Patriots Day. I should say both of these books have been turned into movies. Casey was born in Hyannis, attended Barnstable High School, graduated from Freiburg Academy in Maine and Boston University. As a television news producer at WBZ, he led a high-profile investigation into his aunt's murder, which became the book A Rose for Mary. He also authored The Ice Bucket Challenge and 12, The Inside Story of Tom Brady's Fight for Redemption. Both of these books are now, I understand, being turned into movies. Tonight, Casey will speak about his recent book, The Last Days of John Lennon, which he co-authored with James Peterson and David Wedge. Please join me in welcoming Casey back to Tales of Cape Cod.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming out on a night that, the Red Sox are playing the Astros, so I appreciate it. I'll do my due diligence and try to wrap this up as quickly as possible. I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about John. And as was mentioned, I had the great honor, one of the great honors of my career, to co-author a book with James Patterson. James Patterson, as many of you know, is the best-selling author in the entire world. He's sold more books than J.K. Rowling or anybody else. And I got a call, my agent actually got a call from him 2 years ago after he had read Boston Strong and watched our gripping movie Patriots Day with Mark Wahlberg. And James has written, hundreds of fictional novels about detectives and serial killers, etc. And he wanted to start to write nonfiction books, but with the same themes of the criminal element being woven into them. So he asked my agent, and goes, look, I like Casey's work, I like Dave's work. Have them pitch me 3 ideas. And if I land on one, we'll go for it. So I started to think, I gave him 3 ideas over a weekend, and I probably wrote 150 pages in 2 days on these 3 books. 2 of them were parochial, and I won't mention them because I'll probably write them myself at some point. But what struck me about the Lennon story was, the last 5 years of John's life. Now, I'm sure as all you feel the same way, the Beatles were the soundtrack to my life and to my brother Todd's life. Growing up, my parents, Donnie Sherman and Diane Sullivan, who graduated from Barnstable High School, they put us in a VW bus in 1974 because they didn't like Nixon. And they brought us to Mexico for 6 months to a year just to get away. And during that time, every 8-track was the Beatles. Occasionally, Todd and I would slip in Jackson 5, and we enjoyed that. But we were inundated with Revolver, with the Magical Mystery Tour, and all of the great Beatles albums. And it became kind of the soundtrack to our lives as well. And I had read volumes on John, volumes about the Beatles, but those last 5 years were always a mystery to me. And that's what I sold Patterson. I said, this can be a true crime book, but we also never want to lose John in the pages. He has to stand out. It's got to be his journey. People need to be inspired by him, but also it's a cautionary tale, because what you'll see in this story here are three of the themes that we still grapple with today as a society. Religiosity, which I'll get into. The lack of attention to mental health, which I'll get into. And the lack of attention to gun regulations, which I'll get into. And, those three issues became, the core of what ultimately led to John's demise on December 8th, 1980. And where our story picks up, we don't really talk we talk a little bit about how the Beatles became the Beatles, from John and Paul getting together at 15 years old, ultimately bringing George Harrison into the fold and later Ringo. And we talk a little bit about the Hamburg experience, but where we pick up is after the I Want to Hold Your Hand, after 1964, it's really 1966 where John's life starts to go down a track that ultimately leads to his death. And what many of you probably remember at the time was in 1966, John gave an interview to a reporter from a record magazine in Britain, and John was talking about the success of the Beatles at the time, and he made an innocuous comment. He said, well, we're bigger than Jesus Christ. Now, the British press rolled their eyes, because that's just John being John. John was a wise ass. John was very acerbic, and John was smart. And, but John was, ironic as well. He wasn't saying he wasn't, pumping out his chest. He was looking at the irony of the situation at the time, saying, isn't it funny that you've got four lads from Liverpool and all of the young people in the UK and in the United States, they're all, piling into record stores like they're churches. We're bigger than the church. And he was... The British press thought anything of it. But as John and the Beatles begin to develop their 1966 American tour, to get death threats. In fact, John's wife Cynthia at the time told him not to go on this tour. You're going to die on this tour. And one of the reasons was because there was two DJs in the Deep South at a radio station that was last in the ratings, and they stumbled upon this interview, and they thought, what a great way to build up our ratings and to get people to listen to us. Let's tell our listeners that the Beatles are against Jesus Christ, and let's stage record burnings, book burnings, everything that they could do to dissuade the Beatles from, their various tour dates. And they did a lot of tours in the Deep South at the time. And you're seeing right here, the result of that. We look at pictures like that, and I think of Nuremberg in 1938. I don't think of the United States, but it happened, and it continues to happen. And not only was this kind of a lark and a harmless threat, kids burning record albums, members of the KKK were stationed outside of the stadiums that the Beatles were performing at. That's a stadium in Maryland. That's not even they didn't even get to the Deep South yet. And you had the KKK stationed outside saying that, we have a plan for the Beatles. And remember, this is 66. So this is less than 3 years after John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. And Ringo Starr tells John, Americans have a fascination with guns. They shoot first and ask questions later. We shouldn't go to the United States. But Brian Epstein, their manager, all the tour dates were already booked, and they would have had to have given back all the money that they had already incurred. So there was no way that the Beatles weren't going to perform in the United States at the time. And every single time they performed at a stadium on the South, in the Midwest, and even on the West Coast, they would have to be driven in almost like they were felons going to court, meaning that John would have to lie on the floor of the van as they were being brought in undercover with police escort, and it's not the way that they envisioned, their next tour of the United States. And not only was John afraid, Paul was afraid, George was afraid, and every time that they would perform, kids in the audience would throw firecrackers onto the stage. And I interviewed Paul for the book, and Paul would say, we jumped. George, myself, Ringo was buying the drum kit, and nobody even thought of Ringo at the time. So it was just, the guys in front, and they would all jump away, and they would look at John, and they said, well, if John's still standing, that means we should keep playing. And John never flinched. John understood what he was dealing with at the time and continued to play. But this is their last public performance beside the rooftop concert they gave in 1969. And see the gates. This is Candlestick Park in San Francisco. They played 6 to 8 songs that night and ran off the stage and never performed live again and went into the studio. Lucky for us, right? Because had the Beatles not gone into the studio, we wouldn't have had Sgt. Pepper's. We wouldn't have had the White Album. We wouldn't have had Abbey Road. But a lot of it was driven by fear, not by the creative process at the time. They were afraid to perform live again in public. And, researching this book, I really focused most of my attention on John and the people around John. So again, getting to interview Paul, and I'll get to that little anecdotal story in a bit, but getting to interview people around him and understanding the relationship he had with his 3 bandmates at the time. It's amazing to think, guys, that the Beatles were only together for 8 years. And we're here in 2021, talking about them. I mean, the creation, the creative impulses that they had in such a short period of time has never been matched and will never be matched. But they also had been together since they were 15 years old, especially John and Paul. And at that time in the late 60s, as you know better than I do, because I was born in 69, they were the most famous faces on the planet. They were the most famous people on the planet. And people were looking at them like deities and not rock stars. That's a heavy, heavy pressure for 4 young men, and, they couldn't withstand it. So they did split up. And they only split up after this amazing, what looks like an impromptu concert on the rooftop of Apple Records on Savile Row in London. In fact, it was something that they were working for some time. Paul wanted a big concert. He wanted to perform in the middle of the Sahara Desert, but they realized, how are you going to get people there? And, Paul wanted to perform in the Grand Canyon. Paul had these big ideas, and God bless Paul, because he kept the band together. He was really the creative genius at the end of the Beatles' run that kept John being interested in Beatles music, because, as we all know, John fell in love. John fell in love with Yoko Ono, an avant-garde artist from Japan. And I'm telling you guys, I go back and forth on Yoko. I do. We all have heard, Yoko broke up the Beatles. And when our book was first announced, I started to get inbound phone calls from a bunch of different people. And one of them was Yoko's lawyer. And Yoko's 7 years older than John. So Yoko is 87 right now. Well, when we were starting the book project, Yoko was still in her 80s, but she'd suffered a stroke, and she was affirmed in a wheelchair. But her lawyer was asking, well, what's in it for us? What's in it for what's in your book that we're going to be able to take? Is there a percentage, Yoko? I'm sorry. I'm like, hell no. That's not what we do. James Patterson's not going to do it. I guarantee you that. I said, I will never pay for an interview. You either want to be a part of this or you don't. And I will say, the one thing, what drove me to the project is that people are losing sight of John, because time passes. We're all here because we have a very strong feeling for him. But my daughter's generation doesn't. They have to be educated. They have to be reminded about who this guy is was not only who he was, but who the Beatles were. I said, if you cooperate with a James Patterson project, we're talking 600 to 1 million copies sold of the book, which has happened already. I said that's really teaching a lot of people not be interested in the Beatles and getting them interested. And I never heard back from the lawyer, so I said, okay, well, the lawyers, we're not going to be able to interview Yoko for this project, and that was fine. But I will say this about Yoko. John was ready to leave the Beatles. John was so sick of, the work pace that Paul had kind of generated for the band. Paul was a taskmaster, brilliant, but he was the business man behind the Beatles after Brian Epstein had passed away, and John just didn't want to do it anymore. He was only inspired when he felt inspired, but he was looking to do other things. John was starting to get political, and without Yoko, John would have never been political. John would have never been the political force we remember him as if Yoko hadn't partnered with him and married him. So let's get back to this concert here. How this all happened was finally John said, and I know I'm in a church and I'm not going to curse, but John said, F it, let's go upstairs. Let's give him a concert up there. And it took about 24 hours for all of the equipment to be loaded up, and they went upstairs, and they went up to the rooftop. And they hadn't performed again live in many years. And this man, Ken Mansfield, who I interviewed for the book, is one of the men he's in that white coat. He was a executive for Apple Records. So he's up there watching John, Paul, Billy Preston, and Ringo. And if you've ever seen the rooftop concert footage, and we're all in for a great treat, because Peter Jackson, the director of the Hobbit trilogy, he's got a new version of Let It Be coming out on Disney Plus next month. And he wove his way through 57 hours of footage that were taken for that documentary. And the ultimate Let It Be documentary in 1970 was all about angst. It was all about four guys at the end of their ropes breaking up. What Peter Jackson saw was, well, that was 20% of what was captured on film. The rest of it was a brotherhood. The rest of it was these four guys getting together again and enjoying the creative process and putting out songs that, still resonate today. And that concert is very, it's beautiful to watch, because you watch John and Paul start to play off each other. And Paul even told me, he goes, Casey, he said, we were the greatest rock and roll band ever. And he goes, all we had to do was get on stage. And we didn't have to rehearse. Once we started a groove together, we knew that there was no band in the world that could beat us. And he was right. And John, this is John's wedding day at the Rock of Gibraltar. And he couldn't get married in Great Britain. He was trying to get married in France, and ultimately he ended up here. But John, again, was really influenced by Yoko's visual creativity, because John had gone to art school as a child, and John would always call himself an artist first, and a guitar player second, and a singer third. Now, there's a famous quote that John gave later on in his Beatles career. I don't know if this is true or not, but it's beautiful. He was working on a homework project in grade school, and the teacher asked everybody in class, what do you want to be when you grow up? And John wrote one word, happy. And she said the next day, you don't understand the assignment. And he said, you don't understand life. And that was John as a young person, influencing people around him, because, this was the first generation post World War II. John had a hellish childhood. His father had basically given him up. His mother, Julia, had basically given him to her sister, Mimi, to raise. And John, at 15 years old, was finally getting re-involved with his mother and spending a lot of time with her. And she was struck down and killed by a drunk driver who was a local police officer who was off duty, never was charged with it. And John was about 15 years old at the time. And one of the reasons why John and Paul became so close is because Paul had lost his mother, Mary, to breast cancer. This guy I don't really like to talk about, but we have to. Mark David Chapman. Now, remember when I told you a little bit about that innocuous 1966 interview that John gave? Well, this is well before internet. So Mark David Chapman is an unusual kid. He's growing up in Decatur, Georgia. He's got mental issues at 6 years old. I was able to obtain his psychological reports. Every time he goes up for parole, all of the psych reports have to be delivered to the parole board. And we were able to get access to every psych report he gave since December 8th, 1980. And he had talked about little people living in his walls. He was fascinated with death at an early age, but he had this whole world living within his walls, and he could kill these little people, when he wanted to. And he would. At 5, 6 years old, his parents were a lot of domestic abuse back and forth. But he was a troubled kid, and he never ever got help. But he was a huge Beatles fan. First album he ever got from his father was Meet the Beatles. And but he was a guy that was easily seduced and easily influenced by anybody that was willing to be friends with him, because he was awkward and just not somebody that you would immediately be gravitate toward. So he became a hippie because the Beatles were hippies. Did a lot of drugs in the late 60s. Then he joined an ultra-right wing Christian group in Decatur, Georgia in the early 1970s when he's 17 years old. And everything's about, it's co-opting the Jesus story for their own personal, reasons. So Mark reads the article about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus Christ. So this is right after Imagine came out. And Mark starts to sing, because he was playing guitar at the time. Imagine John Lennon was dead. And he's singing this to his family. He's singing this to his friends. He puts himself on a path. Now, what we've been led to believe since 1980 is that Mark David Chapman killed John Lennon because he wanted to be famous. That's part of the story. But the story actually begins when he's 17 years old. But John has no idea who Mark David Chapman is. John is moved to New York City because he felt like New York was the Rome of its time, and he wanted to be a part of where all of the creative minds were in the world, and they were all in New York in the early 1970s. But John was, an illegal alien, and I put that in quotes because he had been arrested for cannabis possession in London back in the late 1960s. And this was resin that these police officers had found in a binoculars case. And John, to his dying day, said that wasn't even our stuff, because we smoke pot all the time. But we had rented the apartment, the flat, from Ringo, who had just rented it to Jimi Hendrix. He goes, that was Hendrix's stuff. That wasn't our stuff. We knew the police were out there. We cleaned this thing flat. But it was basically a setup, because there was a certain British police detective who was becoming a celebrity for busting the Rolling Stones, for busting the Who, and then the big Megillah was John Lennon. Well, Yoko was pregnant at the time, and Yoko lost the pregnancy. She miscarried because of that, and John just paid a fine because he didn't want her to suffer any longer than she did, and he said it was his. It was a $200 fine. He never thought he'd have to deal with it again in his life. But when he moved to New York City, it became, much more than a thorn in his side. And the FBI started to really follow John in the early 1970s. And they did so because John gave a concert for another young man who had been busted for pot possession. This guy's name was John Sinclair. John Sinclair lived in Michigan. And he sold two undercover FBI agents, 2 joints. Was sentenced to 10 years in prison for that. So it became a cause celeb. The Black Panthers got behind him. Abby Hoffman got behind him. They had a kind of a fundraising concert for John Sinclair in Detroit. and Bob Seger played. I mean, the concert's great. There's a lot of great people that played, but John Lennon got on stage after midnight with Yoko, and John sang a song that he had written about John Sinclair. And within 10 hours, John Sinclair's sentence was commuted by the governor of Michigan. That's because of Lennon, because of nobody else. Because John's impact was so huge at the time, he was able to literally open prison doors. And you know what? That scared the living bleep out of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did not want any part of John Lennon. Richard Nixon put John near to the top of Richard Nixon's so-called enemies list. So it's interesting, I got the classified FBI notes from that concert in Michigan. And the FBI agents were all undercover. And you can imagine what they must have looked like at this concert, sticking out like sore thumbs wherever the hell they were. And they're writing these notes about the concert afterwards to J. Edgar Hoover. But the notes are critiques of John's music. They're not talking about, well, John sounds a little flat tonight, and God, Yoko is horrible. So John understands and starts to get word that because you have a so-called felony on your record, an arrest for drug possession, you can be deported from the United States. So John began to be followed. John lived on Bank Street in Greenwich Village with Yoko, and there was always an FBI agent parked, across the street. Every time John would leave, he would leave and they would follow him. John was under the belief that his phones were tapped, and we know now that they were. And John told his friends that, if anything happens to me, protect Yoko, because he thought in the early 1970s that the United States government was going to kill him. So that's one of the reasons why John started to retreat from public life. You have George, going on an incredible solo career, Paul doing his thing, Ringo making his solo records, and you may not realize this, but Ringo is the most successful solo artist of the Beatles. It's Ringo. Nobody believes that, but it is. Again, this is, John Winston Ono. John changed his last name to Ono, to befit Yoko. And this is what John was fighting for many years. And ultimately, John wins the right to stay in the United States. And he had people like Norman Mailer, Gloria Swanson, of all people, who was a legendary actress, Sunset Boulevard. She became friends with John because they shared a microbiotic diet, of all things. But people were writing, about John on John's behalf, including Geraldo Rivera. Whatever you think about him today, he was best friends with John and Yoko in the early 1970s. Because Geraldo had exposed abuse at a mental hospital in New York in the early 1970s, where patients were, left without clothes and abused for months. And he brought a hidden camera into the hospital and broke a huge story at the time. And Yoko called the TV station and said, "We want to meet you. You're one of the people that are trying to change the world here, and we want to surround ourselves with people like that." I interviewed Geraldo for the book, and you can read a little bit about that in the story as well. John, after the big win for his deportation case, they decide to settle in New York City permanently, and they buy a place in the Dakota. Raise your hands if you've ever been to the Dakota or seen it physically. So this is where the movie Rosemary's Baby is supposed to take place. The facade you can see, but John and Yoko liked it because it was very private. Roberta Flack lived there. A few other celebrities lived there, and John and Yoko had to convince the co-op board that they were, their drug history was behind them. And many of you probably, if you're John fans or Beatles fans, you have heard the story about the Lost Weekend, where John and Yoko broke up for almost 2 years. John went to LA and really kind of sowed his wild oats because he'd never been a single guy. John was married to Cynthia very early, even before the Beatles, fandom. So he needed to just be a free person, and so did Yoko. And it was Paul McCartney who brought Yoko and John back together. So people think that Paul hates Yoko. He doesn't. He's the one who brought John back together with Yoko. And once they got back together, they decided to have a child, Sean. Now, I get a little emotional because people, get frustrated that there were 5 years that John wasn't recording. 5 years that he could have given beautiful music to the world. Well, he was giving beautiful music to that boy. Those are the only 5 years that Sean would have with John. So, you talk about fate and serendipity playing a role in all our lives. And I certainly see this with John Lennon. And when John reverted inside the Dakota, he was still writing. But he was writing bits of songs on his beautiful white piano and putting them aside, never thinking he would record them again. He was the mom and dad for his little boy, Sean. Yoko Ono was running the family business at that point, because at that point, John Lennon was worth about $2 million. Paul McCartney was worth $25 million, because Paul's a smart businessman. So John said, "Mother," when we called Yoko Mother, let us be as rich as Paul is, because they were brothers, but they were still in competition. So Yoko took over the business, and John raised this beautiful, beautiful boy. During this time, John is under threat, and people don't know this. Why did John retreat to the Dakota? Was it a Howard Hughes type of situation? Was he just so sick of the world that he wanted to get away? It's part of it. But he was being threatened by a terrorist group. And I've obtained all of the classified documents from the FBI that stand this story up. There was a separatist group from Puerto Rico back in the late 1970s that was threatening John Lennon. And they were a fringe group that was yearning for Puerto Rican independence at the time. So they wrote John a letter, and they said, "John, we are going to kidnap your child and your wife." And, John had gotten threatening letters since 1966, right? But these terrorists were able to pinpoint exact areas of the Dakota that they had gotten access to. So John knew that they'd been inside the building, and they could get inside the building. So what John did at that time, which, really was against everything John had believed in prior to that, he called the FBI, the very agency he hated and thought was trying to either kill him or get him deported for false reasons. And the FBI began to investigate this case over a period of 6 months. And John received probably 16 letters, and they were all getting more violent. And it was all, "You need to give us $100,000 by this date, or we're going to kidnap your kid." So John actually hired a former FBI agent, this guy, McDougal, Jack McDougal. And Jack McDougal's job before he worked with John, he was a counterintelligence agent for the FBI, chasing down Soviet spies in New York City. So McDougal gets the job, and John and Yoko say, "Protect the boy. Don't worry about us, just protect the boy." And McDougal says, "No, well, John, you're the most famous person in the world. I need to protect you as well. Just focus on the boy." So McDougal, his name was Doug McDougal, not Jack. So McDougal begins to monitor and, walk little Sean around the city and protect him if he went out to Central Park. But Yoko at the time was really into New Age thinking. And remember Nancy Reagan, who was into numerology, with Ron. So was Yoko. So Yoko started to tell this bodyguard, "Well, today it's Wednesday, which means these numbered streets are bad luck. You have to walk Sean on these other streets." And McDougal says, "You're out of your mind." He goes, "If I do that, you're giving the terrorists a pattern on how to abduct your child." So the FBI agent is fired from his job. And John, at that time, retreats fully into the Dakota because the terrorist group just got sick of hounding John. So they wrote him one last letter. We don't want your money anymore. We don't want your fame. We're going to kill you. We're going to kill you at a public place. So if you're out with your wife and your son at a cafe, we're just going to blow it up, and you're going to be part of our cause. So John was not only so concerned about Sean and Yoko, he was concerned about collateral damage. He didn't want anybody else to be harmed, because of what he was going through at the time. The FBI was never able to trace those letters. They did have prime suspects, but those individuals are still free today. This is an interesting picture, and there's a great story behind it. So John, as I mentioned to you, Yoko was really big in numerology. So this is early 1980. John's been a house husband for about 5 years, and Yoko was going to this Japanese numerology sensei, if you will. And the sensei would tell Yoko, there's a dark cloud around your husband. And she'd say, well, how do we get rid of this dark cloud? John needs to go on a trip. John needs to travel. So in early 1980, John and one other person took a worldwide trip by themselves. They went to Japan, they went to China, they went to South Africa. They went all over the place. And there's no recording of that trip. There's no diary of it. No one knows what happened during that trip. But when John got back to New York City, that Japanese sensei said, there's still a dark cloud around you. You need to take another trip, but you need to do it on the water. So John takes 2 weeks of sailing lessons. Yoko hires a crew out of Newport, Rhode Island, and they take a 42-foot vessel from Newport to Bermuda on a sailing trip. And it's John and 4 other people. Well, during the trip, again, John's got the least experience out of anybody. The waves are really strong. And so strong that the whole crew gets sick. They're all in the cabin throwing up on each other. But John had a cast iron stomach because he'd kicked a heroin habit, 5 or 6 years earlier than that. So he was the only one who could sail that vessel. And he's sailing it on his own. And we're talking about swells, maybe 8 feet high, which are huge, for an inexperienced sailor like John. But this was John's rebirth. John coming out of his womb after spending 5 years in the Dakota. John begins to sing sea shanties. He's yelling at the gods to strike him down. He in his own diary said he had basically stripped himself naked, and he's sailing and he's letting the rain and the wind pelt his flesh and his skin, and he's becoming reborn again. And by the time he lands in Bermuda, he's ready. He's ready to record. And so he spends the next several weeks in Bermuda writing what ultimately will become Double Fantasy. Now, Double Fantasy, that's the name of a flower that he found in a botanical garden in Bermuda. And John had all of these, these notes, these lyrics that he had, and he just had to compile them together. That's John in Bermuda. And John was there basically by himself and with Sean. Yoko would come around sporadically, but Yoko's idea was, okay, John is coming out for the first time. It's the biggest musical news in the last decade. Everybody's been waiting to hear John Lennon. And John, because he loves Yoko so much, he gives half of the tracks of the album to her. I don't know if you've ever heard those songs. They're the worst songs they're earworms that you'll never get rid of. But again, it shows how much John loved Yoko. And I don't think Yoko loved him to the degree that he loved her. I really think that, no matter what you say about Yoko Ono, John worshiped everything about Yoko. So again, John begins to record. There's Yoko behind him at the recording sessions, and they're building, some great songs. Some songs that, continue, that haven't been heard even to this day because Yoko wouldn't release them. But John does not know that there's somebody out there lurking in the shadows. And I put this picture up because it goes back to my conversation with Paul McCartney. And again, when you're a journalist and a writer, there are interviews you do that stick with you. And growing up with the Beatles, to have the opportunity to interview Sir Paul McCartney, is a thing that I'm always going to have stay with me. It's all about the journey It's never about the destination. And I asked Paul what the last conversation he had with John was like. Did he remember it? And he said, yeah, he had talked to John maybe a week before John's murder. And I said, well, what did you talk about? And Paul said, well, there was a bread shortage in England because there was a baker's strike. And I had to call John because John had been baking bread for Sean for 5 years. So John had to tell me how to bake bread. And I thought, wow, isn't that so beautiful? You've got the Mozart and the Beethoven of their generation. And the last time they talk isn't about musical composition. It's about providing for their families. And I just thought that just is such a beautiful memory for Paul to have. And as I mentioned, John or Paul didn't know that this man existed. And by this time, Mark David Chapman is in his 20s. He is married to a young Japanese woman who looks eerily similar to Yoko Ono. He is going down a very dark path. He tried to commit suicide twice. He's writing his name. He was a security guard at that time living in Hawaii, writing his name as John Lennon on the ledger. He had never forgot the idea that he was going to kill John, and he realized that his life was so miserable that ultimately there was a part of him that wanted to be famous. And not only did he have John Lennon on his hit list, he had several other people on his hit list as well. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Jackie O, Paul McCartney, Walter Cronkite. In fact, before this night, December 8th, 1980, Mark David Chapman, had gotten into the election night party with President-elect Ronald Reagan. So there was a possibility that Mark David Chapman could have killed Reagan at that night, but he didn't. He waited for John Lennon, and this is a shot outside of the Dakota. That's Mark David Chapman getting John Lennon's autograph on a copy of Double Fantasy. 24 hours before that incident, Mark David Chapman meets another musician on the subway, and we interviewed James Taylor about this. James Taylor met Chapman, and Chapman was odd, but who wasn't odd on the subway in the early 1980s in New York? But he kept on talking about John Lennon, and he just gave Taylor, the chills. And Taylor just got off the subway and went about his merry way. Taylor was 2 buildings down from the Dakota when he heard the 5 shots that night. Didn't realize that it was his friend John, because James Taylor had been signed originally by Apple Records. And John and Paul McCartney had actually sang backup on some of James Taylor's earlier recordings. So here you have John Lennon. This is the first time that John Lennon saw Mark David Chapman that night. John signs his album. John gets in a limo. He goes to do a radio interview, and then he records until about 10:30 at night. And Yoko, at that point, everybody's hungry. Yoko wants to go to an all-night diner and eat. And John says, no, I got to put Sean to bed. John's waiting up for us. And so that's what brought John back. And then Mark David Chapman was across the street, emerges from the darkness, and fires those shots. This is the scene moments later, when obviously everybody started to learn who had been shot that night. Now, we also interviewed all the police officers that responded that night. Mark David Chapman was there holding a copy of Catcher in the Rye, because he had become a Salinger, devotee at the time, and he had actually written letters to Salinger, and Salinger never wrote him back. But he believed himself to be Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye. And what the cops told us was Chapman was so afraid that people would hurt him, because people were getting to the scene after he just killed John Lennon, and he thought Yoko was going to hurt him. And he said, please don't let her hurt me. And the cops, to their credit, said, nobody's going to hurt you, Mark. We're going to take you down and process you and kind of find out where this happened. Well, as all of this is happening in real time, that's Yoko at the police precinct that night. There's an ABC producer, this guy named Alan Weiss, who I interviewed for the book. He took me to dinner in New York City. Actually, I took him to dinner. Cost me about $500 and 6 hours of my life. And I'm glad it was recorded because we both didn't even make it out of there. Thank God for Uber at that night. But the story he told was he was a producer for ABC News, and he was at the ER at Roosevelt Hospital because he had been involved in a motorcycle accident. He fell off his bike and got road rash on a bunch of skin abrasions, and he's laying in the ER, and he sees a stretcher come in and wheel past him. And then momentarily later, he sees a Japanese woman coming in. And he says, is that Yoko? And he's starting to think, oh my God, there's a story here. So even though he's being treated, he's, a journalist first, and he's trying to think, is this John Lennon that's been brought in? Now, I also interviewed a surgeon, an ER surgeon named David Halloran. David Halloran massaged John Lennon's heart that night. He had brought it out of his body and tried to. John Lennon was DOA when he got there, but Halloran said, we do this for everybody. We don't give up. And he didn't know who it was because, John's glasses were off. John didn't have any identification on him. They were all in rumpled up clothes in the corner of the ER. And finally, somebody said a nurse picked up that leather jacket, or John's leather jacket, and they rifled through the pockets and they found his wallet. And there was a black credit card on American Express, John Lennon. He said, do you know who this is? And that's when it all came down to the people that were in that emergency room trying to save John's life. But again, they tried, and they couldn't do it. So here is Alan Weiss, who's got the scoop of the century. John Lennon is shot. John Lennon is dead. He's gotten confirmation by the orderlies, and at that point, that you have that information, you run with it. So he limped his way to a payphone in the hospital, and he called ABC News. And it just so happens that the Patriots were playing the Miami Dolphins on Monday Night Football that night. So the person that broke the news of John Lennon's murder to the entire world was Howard Cosell. So that call had to go all the way to Miami, where there was a truck outside of the stadium in this confirmation that John Lennon is murdered. And Howard Cosell knew John Lennon. John Lennon, if you go on YouTube, there's a piece of film where John Lennon is actually in the booth during a Monday Night Football game talking to Howard Cosell. And it's really interesting because John is trying to compare it to soccer and realizes how big football is in America. So again, Howard Cosell knew John. But Howard Cosell, being the football guy that he was and the professional broadcaster, he wasn't going to announce it because it was the football game was about to go into overtime. And he thought, there's playoff implications. We can't just announce this. And it was Frank Gifford that said, no, you have to announce it because this news is going to change the world. And it did. And that's how everybody in this room first heard that John Lennon had been assassinated. There's, if you all recall, the wonderful moment, very tragic indeed, John's only public memorial service. Now, John's body was cremated. It's ironic that the FBI agent that had been fired for not willing to go by Yoko's idea of how to protect their son, he had an interview to get his job back the day after John was assassinated. So that was a scheduled interview that he had with Yoko because he'd reached out to Yoko. He said, you're coming back. John is coming back. He's the biggest figure in the world. He needs protection. Sure. We'll get to you. December 9th, we'll book an appointment. Well, December 8th happened, and John was killed. So Doug McDougal, his job at that time was to get Julian Lennon off a plane from London. Now, Julian was John's first son. And there was an interesting, sad relationship between the two of them. All of the love that John put into his relationship with Sean, he did not put into his relationship with his teenage son. which is tragic. And I think that's one of the, those things that you question about John. As beautiful a human being as he was still very edgy and very conflicted. But McDougal had to get Julian off the plane and get him to the Dakota. And as he's walking Julian into the Dakota, a fan lunges forward, and McDougal, to his dying day, said, "I think I broke that guy's arm." He goes, "I don't know what that guy had in his arm, but he didn't get anywhere near Julian because I had him down and I heard something snap." And Julian was able to get in there unaccosted, but McDougal had to bring John's body to a mortuary. And because of every news organization was following the trail of John's casket, they had to hire two hearses. One, a decoy, and the hearse that McDougal took. And McDougal took John's remains to a mortuary in Long Island, brought it back in basically a flower box that you'd normally fill with roses. And when he got back to the Dakota, he talked to John's, personal assistant. And the Dakota says, the personal assistant, Fred Seaman, looks at McDougal in the box and he goes, "What is that?" He goes, "That's the greatest rock and roll man that ever lived." So I put this picture up there because I think it's poignant and it's prescient. As I mentioned, this is a story about lack of mental health issues or recognizing mental health, lack of gun laws and religiosity. There was a figure among those 200,000 in that park, Central Park, that day, and his name was John Hinckley. 8 months later, he tried to kill Ronald Reagan. So, when we were starting the process of going down this road, in writing the book that ultimately James Patterson would edit, it all became access, right? I talk about the incredible opportunity to interview Paul and a lot of the people around John, and then getting into, who Mark David Chapman was. We had sent an email to the prosecutor for Lower Manhattan requesting any files that he had on John Lennon's assassination. And we have to do that just to cross our T's and dot our I's. We never thought we'd hear from this person again because nobody, including 60 Minutes, had been granted access to these files in 30 years. So we send the email, we don't hear anything, and then we get an email back. Access accepted. Your recommendation has been granted, but it's going to take us 24 hours to gather up all of the information that we have. And myself and my co-author are looking at each other like, "Oh my God." Some intern must have gotten on the computer and just said, "Oh, I guess these guys, must be granted this permission." So he allowed us to do it. So the next day, we're on an Acela from Boston to New York, and we're waiting for that other email to say, you know what? Sorry, guys, but you're bleep out of luck. It doesn't happen. And we finally get to the criminal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. And we go up to the 10th floor, and we have our little ticket, which we printed out. It's a numbered ticket. And we give it to the clerk, and he looks at it, and there is a big partition of glass, and he goes back and he looks along his wall. And that's where all the case files are of any different criminal case that they were adjudicating at the time. And he matches our ticket up with this thin vanilla envelope and pulls it out, and we're like, "Oh God, we came down here for nothing." I don't know if you guys have seen the show Storage Wars, where you basically gamble on a storage unit and you don't know what's in it. It could be a treasure, it could be nothing. That's how we felt. We had to do it. And he looks at that manila envelope and he realizes it's wrong. And then he comes over and he pulls down a huge box. And inside that box is over 1,000 documents, going back to that night, including the original arrest warrant for Mark David Chapman. So holding it, this is his signature from December 8th, 1980. It's a very ethereal feeling. It's not only something to write about something, but you have to look at it and feel it. And a lot of times, any books that I've ever written, that's what brings you a little closer to the subject matter. And I remember at noon that day, the whole courthouse shuts down for an hour for lunch, and we're trying to copy everything we can, but we get kicked out of the building. And we find an Irish pub about a block away from the building, and this Irish pub is a typical Irish pub in New York City. We walk in there, and what do we hear on the jukebox? John Lennon, All You Need Is Love. And no way is that song playing in an Irish pub in New York City. We just thought, geez, isn't this incredibly ethereal? There's something guiding us here, and ultimately it became the story that we told. And again, if you buy the book, and I'll be happy to sign it for you, it's a story about John. As much as we have to include the killer, because I think it's a cautionary tale, it's really a story about triumph, and John is at the heart of it. And that's why we're all here tonight, 41 years almost after his tragic death. But he stays with us, and that's what Paul said to me. He's with me every day. He goes, John left his body in 1980, but there's not a moment that I don't feel him, that I don't see him, that I don't hear him. And I think that anybody that reads this book, will get the same story as well, hopefully. While I have you here, I'll talk a little bit about, I published 2 books in 2020. And the second book, which also became a New York Times bestseller, is a little different. It's called Hunting Whitey, The Hunt for Whitey Bulger. Now, anybody here has heard about Whitey Bulger, may have read some books about Whitey Bulger. We didn't care about that when I first decided to write this story. This is a story not about Bulger's crimes, although I go back into it. It's about Bulger's 13 years on the run and how he was captured, which to me was the fascinating, untold story about Bulger. And the one thing about being lucky as a journalist and as a writer, we got access to everything the FBI ever had. Because finally they said, look, Bulger was a bad guy, and he co-opted people in the FBI for years. That story's been well told in movies and in several books. These are pictures of Bulger. But, these FBI experts and analysts came along years later, and they'd only heard rumors about Bulger, and they wanted more so than anything to find and capture Whitey Bulger, again, who had gone on the run in 1994. In the book, Hunting Whitey, I got access to 70 letters that Bulger wrote in his own hand. I'm the only journalist, along with my partner, who has gotten access to Whitey Bulger's apartment in Santa Monica, California. So we got inside. We weren't reporting on the outside, we got inside. We walked the grid. We saw where Whitey Bulger was hiding out for the last years of his life. And he was hiding out with his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, who became the key to Bulger's ultimate demise. Now, Bulger, when he first went on the run, he and his girlfriend ended up here, Grand Isle, Louisiana, which was just hard hit by a hurricane a couple of weeks ago. I interviewed the family that they had taken under their wing while they were there, under the aliases Tom and Helen Baxter. And they basically brought this family who was down on their luck to Walmart, bought all the kids' groceries and clothes for school. And the connection that Bulger had with this family were their pets. Bulger and his girlfriend were huge animal lovers. Bulger could kill you without even looking at you. But you want to harm a dog? And he'd weep. And one of the young men in this family had a dog that had a litter of puppies. And there are very rudimentary vets down in the bayou of Louisiana. So when that puppy got sick, they had to take it out back and kill it. And Bulger was there at the time, and Bulger said, I know you're going to shoot this puppy, but don't let me see it. I have to walk away. And as Bulger's walking away, he's weeping when the gunshot is fired. So you have this really unique, sociopath at play here. And these are some of, the results of Bulger's demonic acts, if you will. This was a girl, her name is Debbie Davis. Her remains were unearthed, and myself and my co-author were down, while the FBI and the state police were digging up her body well over 10 years ago. This is interesting. Everybody seen The Departed? So has Bulger. Bulger watched this movie the day it came out in San Diego, California, while he was on the run. And there was another person also in the cinema at the time. Some people might recognize the name because he graduated from Barnstable High School. His name is Richard Eaton. Richard Eaton, everybody knew him as Huffa when we were growing up, was a deputy sheriff in San Diego in the early 1990s, and he was testifying at a drug trial across the street at the courthouse. But there was a big lapse in testimony, so he wanted to catch this movie allegedly about Whitey Bulger. So here he is in a darkened theater, and he looks 4 rows down, and there's Whitey Bulger watching the fictitious version of himself on screen. And that's kind of who Whitey Bulger was. He really believed in his own mythology. The unfortunate thing for Eaton was unarmed. Eaton had to leave his weapon, his service weapon, at the courthouse. And he always knew that Bulger was lethal and armed, regardless of his age. And he didn't want to create an incident in the middle of a packed theater because people would have died. And he chased Bulger onto a trolley that headed south toward Mexico, and he never saw Whitey Bulger again. But he notified the FBI immediately that Bulger is in Southern California, and the FBI never picked up on it. They never tracked it down. They never followed up on the alleged sighting. Instead, they spent most of their time in Italy, France, London. Great places for an FBI agent to go on vacation, on the off chance you might find Bulger. Didn't happen, of course, because Bulger was right almost exactly where Richard Eaton was. And then this woman takes over the investigation. What I love about her is she's a female. Her name is Noreen Gleason. Whitey Bulger hated women. He always treated them like third-class citizens. He killed 2 women with his bare hands. So you have a FBI agent who's the second special agent in charge of the Boston office. She comes up to Boston from New York, and she asks her boss, "What's up? What's my priority? Find Whitey Bulger." She's like, "Really? Do you really want to find him?" And then she goes into the pen where all the FBI agents are, and she looks at all the guys, and they've got their heads down at their desks. They look like they're beaten. She's like, "Not with these guys. I want to bring in my own heavy hitters, my own fugitive hunters from outside Boston. If you really want to find them, I'll find them for you." And within 2 years, they were able to find Whitey Bulger, and they did it through basically these photographs right here. So Catherine Gregg, as I mentioned, was Whitey Bulger's girlfriend on the run, but there had never been a really clear photograph of Catherine while she was a fugitive. So nobody really knew what she might look like now. But the FBI agents had re-interviewed everybody, the new FBI agents did, everybody that had been interviewed 10 years before, and they found out that Catherine had augmenting surgery, breast implants, rhinoplasty, and they tracked down her plastic surgeon in Boston. And the plastic surgeon said, "I don't know if I have anything left that might be from that era. That's, 15 years ago." So the FBI agents go about their business. One FBI agent's about to leave the job one night to go to his son's Little League game in Connecticut. And the plastic surgeon says, "Well, I have the files." And the FBI agent says, "All right, I'll go pick them up on Monday." "Well, do you want the pictures too?" "I'll be over in 5 minutes." So these are the photographs, these very tight photographs of Catherine Gregg. And what the FBI did brilliantly was they created their own public service announcement. Now, Whitey Bulger had been featured on America's Most Wanted on Fox 13 times. And they had generated, those appearances had generated thousands of sightings. Any old guy with a Boston Red Sox hat and a pair, you, my friend, the guy in the front row here. Yes. You're lucky you could have been brought in for questioning. But that was basically how they treated it. And what the FBI did is they said, okay, we're going to create our own commercial. We're going to highlight these photographs, and we're going to tell the audience that she's in danger. And we don't know if she's in danger, but we're going to tell the audience she is. And we're going to air these commercials during Ellen, during Dr. Phil, during shows in the midday that more women watch. So it would be a sisterhood, if you will, that would ultimately drag down Whitey Bulger. So they run the PSAs, and the only market that they didn't have enough money to run it in was LA, because they only had a certain amount of budget to run these spots in. Fortunately, it became such a unique law enforcement tool, and then picked it up. The BBC picked it up, and there was a woman in Iceland who just happened to be Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg's former neighbor, and she called the tip line amongst thousands. She didn't just say, he's a guy that looks like this, I've got a name and I've got an address. And she goes, I know it's him. And well, how do you know? Well, myself and Catherine, or Carol Gasco was her alias, they fed a stray cat together. So again, it was a pet that ultimately brought Whitey Bulger down. And Whitey Bulger always said, that cat's going to be the friggin' death of me. And it turned out, kind of was. But another thing that really struck the neighbor was that Bulger was, he was incredibly racist. He hated Obama, and this woman was ultimately progressive, and she just hated this guy. So anything he ever said to her, she always remembered it, remembered everything he ever said. So she calls into the tip line, gives the address and the number. So this is inside Whitey Bulger's apartment. Now there's a punching dummy on the left-hand side. It's wearing a fedora, because that's why Bulger would stick that in the middle of a window, because he thought if anybody was going to come and kill him, that they would shoot that dummy first, and he would have an opportunity to either shoot back or get out with his life. So ultimately, it leads to this man right here. This guy, his name is Scott Garriola. He is I would say, the most efficient FBI manhunter in the Bureau's history. He has brought down several cartel members, drug lords, you name it. He's brought them in for the cold, from the cold, I should say. He's on vacation at a Dick's Sporting Goods in L.A. on the day they get the tip. And they know that he's got to be the one to bring him down because he's so damn good. So he gets a text, and it says, possible Bulger sighting, call in. He's got his kids, he's got his fishing poles. I'm on vacation, but it's Bulger. I got to call this in. So he calls, they give him the information, and he says, I need to talk to the tipster before I act on this. So they transfer the call to Iceland and this woman. She goes through her story, and at the end of that 20-minute conversation, he says, I gotta know, how sure are you that it's Bulger that we're looking for? She goes, that's just it, Agent Garriola. I'm not 100% it's him. I'm 200% it's him. And he says, game on. And he's gonna round up his agents over the course of an hour to surround Bulger's building in Santa Monica. And none of the agents in the FBI even know who Whitey Bulger is. So he's got to say, have you seen The Departed? Okay, it's Jack Nicholson that we're trying to get. So he's trying to convince them that it's a big deal. So he eventually surrounds Bulger's apartment and lures him out of his apartment. And basically how he did it was a cat and mouse game, because they knew that Bulger ultimately was never going to go without a fight, and that Bulger had several weapons in his apartment, which he did. So the only way to get him out was to lure him. And they said they had the apartment house manager call Bulger and say, there's been a break-in in your unit down in the basement. We can call the police, or you can come down and take a look at it. Bulger wasn't going to let him call the police. So he was going down the elevator, and ultimately he gets there and he sees the agents. And Bulger wrote a letter to a friend where he describes how he felt going down the elevator. He said he knew something was wrong. And then there was a debate in the middle of this standoff. Scott Garriola told Bulger to kneel down. Now look at what Bulger's wearing. He's wearing an all-white ensemble. Bulger wasn't going to kneel down because there was oil on the floor, and he didn't want to get his pants dirty. So Bulger was almost ready to get his head blown off because he didn't want to look dirty for his arrest photo. And there was a woman doing laundry down in the garage at the time, and Bulger's girlfriend, Catherine, had always told the neighbors, because he was such a pain in the ass, that he's got Alzheimer's. He's got dementia. Don't worry about what he says. So this woman doing her laundry says, what are you doing with this guy? He's got dementia. He's got Alzheimer's. You got the wrong guy. And Bulger looks at her and looks at the FBI agents, and he says something very derogatory to her and says, "No, you got the right guy. I'm Jimmy effing Bulger." This is Catherine and Whitey being let off. These are the only photos that have ever been taken. And I'll show you this. These are some of the weapons that Bulger, these were in his apartment, in the walls that we were able to get access to when we wrote the book itself. This is Bulger, the last photograph ever of Whitey Bulger in prison. And he was taking art classes at a prison in Arizona. And ultimately, he had angered somebody in the prison system there. He got transferred to a place in Florida, near Orlando, and ultimately he ends up at a place called Misery Mountain in West Virginia. And he's murdered 12 hours after he arrives. The man on the left, his name is Freddie Gias. He's Bulger's killer. We've interviewed him several times. We're the only ones who have ever interviewed Freddie, and we do it through correspondence. Freddie writes us letters in a rubber tip pencil because the guards won't give him anything sharp because they're afraid he's going to jab his neck or try to kill them. But we take you inside the cell when Bulger is murdered. We talk about the conspiracy behind it. It's the most in-depth book that's ever been written about the entire Bulger saga. And that is Hunting Whitey. We don't have copies here, but you can get it in your local library if you want. And next summer, get ready for Helltown. Helltown is a story about Kurt Vonnegut and Norman Mailer and their obsession with a murder case in 1969 in Provincetown. Now, I've covered maybe 150 homicides in my career. I've never seen anything this bad. It was absolutely vicious. A young hippie-like messiah, similar to Charles Manson, luring young women into a cemetery and not only killing them, but dismembering their bodies. But the story itself is a story about Vonnegut and Mailer and who they were at various stages of their lives. In 1969, Norman Mailer was a household name. Nobody knew who Kurt Vonnegut was. He had not published Slaughterhouse-5 yet. He's living right down the street here, and he's angry. And he decides to put all of his passions and obsession into writing about this case. So I'm working with Robert Downey Jr. right now to adapt this book for HBO. So Robert Downey Jr. is going to play Kurt Vonnegut, and we think Mark Ruffalo is going to play Mailer. And I'm going to test your 1980s trivia right now. There was a movie in the 1980s starring Rodney Dangerfield called Back to School. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it. Robert Downey Jr. was in that movie, and Kurt Vonnegut had a cameo in that movie, which is what drew Robert Downey Jr. to this project. He said, I met him once, I was fascinated by him. He was an odd guy, but I thought he was so brilliant, I want to be a part of this project. And, we'll see what happens. So I want to thank everybody for spending some time with me tonight. Anybody has any questions, you can ask me here or down when I'm doing some signing here. Anything? Yes?
You mentioned something about the gun laws for John Lennon. What was it about the gun?
Well, I mean, you could bring your gun on a plane. He brought a Chatter Arms 33 on a plane from Honolulu to New York without any license. But again, he was able to move very quickly without gun laws in place. And as I said, I mean, I think you look at some of the issues we struggle with as a society today. They came to bear, in ultimately the assassination of John Lennon. And it's interesting that, as we all know, George Harrison died of lung cancer, but he was attacked, 7 years before he ultimately died. And because he was stabbed so viciously in his lungs when he contracted cancer, he did not have the tissue or the strength to withstand that disease, and he died. So there is a cause and effect of the attack on George and ultimately what happened to him. Anybody else? All right. Oh, yeah.
How many people did you interview for the John Lennon?
We interviewed 20 people that knew John. So again, we have a whole list of, people that we interviewed in the book.
How many hours of tape did you have?
At least 40 hours of tape, including the 6 hours that I get drunk in New York City with the producer. That'll be the, unplugged version of this, but you're only as good as the access that you get. And I think because, we're empathetic people and sympathetic, and we tell, stories the right way, people are more trustful with us in the long run, so we've benefited from that. All right, thanks, everybody.